Welcome to the Storybooker's Untranslated, a show where I look at Japanese novels that were never translated into English. Today's novel starts with a TV show. Ashita no Nadja was a Saturday morning anime that aired for 1 year from 2003 to 2004, after Ojamajo Doremi ended, and immediately before the show that launched the ongoing Pretty Cure franchise. Ashita no Nadja was the story of an English orphan, aged 12 to 13, who learns that her mother might still be alive, but not in England. So she joins a traveling circus as a dancer, makes a lot of friends, falls in love. Nadja is a story about optimism in the face of adversity and the love between a mother and a daughter. It was a show targeted at very young girls, but ended up being a big hit with mothers of very young children. The ending hinted at a sequel, but there never was one. Until last September. A novel came out titled Ashita no Nadja, The Journey Begins at Age 16. Even though this is a relatively recent publication, I don't imagine it'll ever be translated into English, so I figured I'd summarize the story for you instead. It's been 15 years since the show aired, and I fully admit, I only watched a few episodes to make this video. So for the most part, it's been a solid decade or so since I've seen any of this show. But that said, you don't need to have seen the show to read this. It's packed full of any relevant information recapped from the show. Theoretically, you could read this book and follow along no problem even if you never watched the show, but at the same time the book is geared toward people who like the show, so it doesn't do a whole lot of work trying to get you invested in the characters, it assumes you already are. We start out with a prologue where Nadja recalls telling her mother about Francis and Keith. It recaps her relationships with them and how they were two sides of the same coin, trying to make the world a more equal place, Keith by playing Robin Hood and Francis by playing the benevolent prince. We're reminded that Nadja couldn't choose between them and that her mother told her that 13 might be too young to make such decisions about her love life, and that she would know in time which one was right for her. So we're primed to think that this story is going to be about Nadja choosing between Keith and Francis, or at least that the twins will feature prominently. Let's see how that goes. Chapter 1 opens with Nadja baking scones for her mother Colette. After a short scene between them, we launch into a quick recap of the events that led to them being separated, and we quickly find out that they're retconning the end of the show. As you might recall, the show ended with Duke Preminger trying to force Nadja into becoming his heir, Nadja declaring that she'll go on traveling with Troop Dandelion because now she knows where her mom is and she can come visit anytime she wants. She rushes out the door, and Troop Dandelion are waiting there for her with open arms. Well, according to this book, right after that, Troop Dandelion told Nadja that she was welcome to come with them if she wanted, but she should treasure what time she has with her mother, especially since they've already lost 13 years. So Nadja turned right back around and went to live with Colette and her husband, Count Waldmüller. Nadja has a picture-perfect life with her mother and stepfather. They adore her, and eventually Duke Preminger has come to see the light as well. Instead of trying to force Nadja to be his heir and force her to go to boarding school, he instead sends tutors to teach Nadja any subject she wants to learn. He's explained to her that education means more opportunities in life, and Nadja agrees with him. So Nadja's about to turn 16, and decides it's time to go back to Troop Dandelion. She exchanges letters with them regularly, so she has a vague idea of where they are and is planning to just sort of set out and find them. Colette, by the way, is totally cool with this plan. So Nadja has obviously outgrown the clothes that she used to travel in when she was 13, but she wants to travel in a dress that looks like the Applefield uniform to make herself more recognizable. So she asks Colette to make such a dress for her, and Colette agrees. Anyway, Colette and Nadja talk about Francis and Keith, and Colette says that Nadja's clock has stopped because apparently she hasn't seen Keith in the 3 years since the end of the show. Colette suggests that Nadja needs to see Keith again before her clock can start moving. Duke Preminger also makes clear to Nadja that he won't force her to be his heir, but he wants to give her more time to choose whether or not this is something she'd like to do. He tells her how the world is changing and how he believes that Nadja could do a really good job of bringing the noble house into the future. The interactions between Nadja and her grandfather are actually really sweet and my favorite part of this book. Nadja's planning to leave after her birthday ball, and who should show up at this ball but Francis? Francis tells Nadja that he's come up with a new way to better the world. He's realized that what the poor really lack is education, and he's planning on building a school for anyone who wants to attend, child or adult. He also asks Nadja to contact him if she ever sees Keith, because he hasn't seen Keith in years either. Then there's this weird possessive speech where he tells Nadja that he doesn't want to let her go, but he knows that she couldn't live in a cage. And he concludes that she's his goddess of destiny, a phrase from the show that continues to be used to death in this book, but tells her that he knows that she doesn't have a reply, and that's fine. Nadja's pretty much just a passive observer of this speech. Then it turns out that Troop Dandelion are just outside, because Colette might have been fine with Nadja's not really a plan, but Count Waldmüller was not, so he contacted the troop and had them come to pick her up. Troop Dandelion is exactly the same with a few notable exceptions. Sylvie is gone. Apparently she left to chase Raphael, and no one's heard from her since. And Cream and Chocolat are now full-grown lions. I have no idea how they fit into that caravan car, and this is never explained. Anyway, the troupe travel to Salzburg, then to Innsbruck, then to the mountains outside Innsbruck, and tragedy strikes. The car breaks down, the weather turns bad, and the troupe just has time to retrieve their luggage and the car engine before the river sweeps the car away. So they take the stagecoach to Paris, again it's not explained how the lions are transported, where they struggle to get an audience. It turns out that the car itself was one of their major attractions, and without it there's a lot less interest. But they also reunite with Harvey and TJ Livingston, and Oliver Applefield. Nothing has changed. TJ and Kennosuke are still at each other's throats all the time. Oliver is still in love with Nadja but can't tell her and just ends up fighting with TJ and Kennosuke who don't want him to tell her. Harvey, who you might recall was obsessed with the identity of the Black Rose in the show, is now obsessed with the identity of a secretive business tycoon who goes by the name Harold Brighton. 3 guesses as to who Harold Brighton is, and the last 2 don't count. Anyway, Harvey writes some articles about the troupe to generate public interest, and gets them a gig at a local theatre, called Rushinyu. It's a success and everything seems to be looking up. Around this time, Harvey and TJ go on a month-long trip to the US. While the Livingston brothers are gone, Nadja runs into a man who calls himself Pierre Dupont, who claims to know her mother. He explains that he saw her performance at Rushinyu, and claims to be representing the owner of the theatre, who wants to sell it. He offers a discounted price for Troupe Dandelion, but of course even the discounted price is too much for them. Now Colette had a diamond collection in the show, and would buy a new carved-to-order diamond every year to represent Nadja's age, while she thought that her daughter was dead. She's continued this since Nadja came to live with her, but now she's given all the diamonds to Nadja. So Nadja has 16 diamonds, 12 of which she sells to buy the theatre for the troupe. Only it turns out they didn't buy Rushinyu. They bought another theatre, Rushiguneto, which is a dump. They find Dupont and confront him, but he points out that the correct name was always in the documents, and he never specifically said which theatre he was selling to them. We, the readers, then find out that he's actually an actor hired by another figure, Rosemary Applefield, who's been clawing her way up the social ladder in Paris. She saw an opportunity when the troupe came to Paris, and came up with the scheme using information from Harvey's articles. She pays Dupont a pittance, and plans to use the money to start a business of her own in America. Nadja, of course, is an optimist through and through, and sees the rich history of the theatre that they bought. They start making plans to renovate the theatre, including using the engine from the car to make a moving stage. The only problem is they need money. So, looking for a patron, Nadja gets in touch with Leonardo and Thierry, and they promise to introduce her to a Madame Boayo at a masquerade ball. Madame Boayo immediately rejects the idea of donating to the theatre, but Nadja explains that she's not looking for donations, she's looking for investors. She has the plans for the renovations, and she'll show them to anyone who might be interested in investing. Madame Boayo looks at the plans and immediately starts lecturing Nadja. And at first Nadja thinks she's being rejected, but then she realizes that she's actually getting helpful advice. Madame Boayo tells Nadja to rewrite the plans and bring them back, and then she'll invest. There are also several other guests who express an interest in this investment. At the ball, Leonardo and Thierry draw Nadja's attention to Francis, so she goes over to say hi. After they've been talking for a little while, Nadja realizes that this isn't Francis at all. It's Keith. Not that this is a surprise to the reader. The chapter title is Keith Beneath the Mask. Nadja berates Keith for disappearing and asks where he was. It turns out he was in India, where the sheer number of poor, miserable people drove him to despair. He decided that the whole endeavor of trying to create a world where everyone is equal is stupid, and became a businessman instead. Surprise, he's Harold Brighton. Nadja says, "This isn't you," and he replies, "I'm not the you knew." He offers to invest in Nadja's theatre, but when Nadja says no, he agrees to respect her wishes. He also promises not to kiss her without warning the way he used to. He makes it clear that he's looking to the future, and to the world that will be. Their encounter ends with Nadja shouting an insult to his back, and Keith thinking wryly to himself that Nadja is his goddess of destiny. In a way, the tables have turned. Francis is the more pushy one now. If anything, Keith is pushing Nadja away. So Nadja rewrites the plans for the theatre, and gets her investors. They renovate the theatre and open to a huge success. They decide not to sell tickets, and only take however much money the audience feel like paying, the way they used to when they performed in the streets. The book ends with a nameless seamstress girl in Paris, hearing about Dandelion Theatre. She remembers, hey, wasn't that the traveling circus that Nadja joined? And comes to the theatre, where, sure enough, she reunites with Nadja. Turns out this is Nicole Applefield, another girl that Nadja grew up with. Nadja thinks to herself that they'll be together forever, and sure enough, shortly afterwards, Nicole joins the troupe as their seamstress, alongside Granny. If that seems abrupt, it really is. All of this happens on the very last page. And that was the Nadja sequel. So the major plot threads are still left hanging. whether or not Nadja will become heir to the House of Preminger, whether Nadja will choose Keith or Francis, or neither. But at the same time, it was quintessentially Nadja. It was a story of how things are changing for the troupe, and Nadja uses her education and all the resources she has at her fingertips to try and make the best of a bad situation, and succeeds. It was a sweet story. The only thing that I was a little disappointed about was that we never saw Sylvie again in this. But I also know that there are a couple CD dramas that I've never listened to, so it's possible that the story continues in those. If you're interested, there's a blog post that accompanies this video, link in the description. And if not, thanks for watching and hope to see you next time.